Welcome to the HighExistence podcast, where we challenge the way you live. We explore all aspects of the human experience in order to maximize and fulfill our individual and collective potential. If you're interested in undertaking a grand life experiment to become a more enlightened version of yourself, check out our course, 30 Challenges to Enlightenment, at store.highexistence.com. Use the code word WISDOM at checkout to get 10% off the course. I'm your host, John Waterlow. You can find me over on HighExistence and at my own podcast, Voices in the Dark.
So I'm sitting here next to John, and we just spoke with Peter for our podcast, and we've been reflecting on the podcast we did yesterday with Dennis McKenna, and figuring out like what to say and how to introduce him. Which is interesting.
It's challenging because he's both someone that we're very familiar with and is a very big deal in terms of this conference. We're at the Psychedelics conference called Breaking Convention 2017. People have been mobbing him constantly, getting his attention, so it was great to get a chance to sit down with him. But he's a man hard to encapsulate. As both the brother of Terence McKenna, very famous sort of psychedelics advocate, but Dennis has been just as, or maybe increasingly more important, by taking the more science-focused route as an ethnobotanist who's done a lot of work with psychedelic medicines and has brought them to the forefront whilst retaining this sense of here's the science, but also the spiritual dimension is incredibly important.
His message was so broad, but so important, I think, and was so full of paradigm-breaking ideas that it's so hard to just put your finger on one specific thing he said or why you should listen to the podcast. So like, how do you introduce then this to people who made the whole range of people? Some already maybe read his books, some just know his brother, some people might not know who he is at all. So like, how do you...
My time's grasping in the air, trying to encapsulate
I can't grasp it now. So
well, Dennis had a lot to say about the importance both of taking an ecological perspective. Like, it's not something I would have thought of when we talk about raising consciousness, or not automatically thought of, raising consciousness, improving your own life, not being fixed in power systems that your current government and different cultural paradigms fix you in. But think of it too as this is potentially the breaking point for the earth. Mm-hmm. That we need to be aware from the environmental perspective that an awful lot is on the line, not just whether you personally have a happy life.
And I do think those are actually the same team, because having a happy life means you are living with other intelligent beings, and one of them is nature, and another one is other human beings, and we do live in an ecological context. And if that context gets worse, that our lives, it's going to be much harder to be happy or actually fulfill our mission on this planet. So I think that's why his message is so important.
This is a big podcast with big themes.
Big.
There's something very big. There's something for everyone in here. Huge, the hugest.
Tremendous podcast.
It's tremendous. It's tremendous. It's the best podcast ever.
Yeah, making spirituality great again.
That's what the title will be, Making Spirituality Great Again. So I know everyone's going to enjoy this, and will share this around with their friends. The message is really important, and we had a lot of fun along the way too. So thanks again to Dennis for giving us his time. Before the conference, he was in a documentary, he was in Iceland, he's been all over doing every conference. So it was great to have the opportunity to spend a good solid hour with him.
Yeah, he's running a marathon of giving speeches and everything. So really thankful to Dennis. And thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing our content and being a fan of HighExistence.
Okay, so Dennis McKenna, welcome to the HighExistence podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And it's always fun inviting or introducing a podcast when we're also at another event. We're at Breaking Convention 2017.
Right.
There's a lot of psychedelic conferences going on, and you're having to run around nearly all of them. How do you feel this? What this tells us about this moment in time? Are we seeing a real turning point in the progress for psychedelic research?
I think so. I mean, I think we're all inside the bubble, right? So we don't really get a perspective on what people outside the bubble think, or they don't even know about it. But it doesn't really matter. I do think that there's a renaissance, obviously, in interest in psychedelics from all angles. So, yeah, I'm happy to see that happen. I really feel like psychedelics, and especially from my point of view, plant medicines are maybe the last best hope that we have to get woken up. And I really think that planet is in peril, and I think the only thing that's going to save us is a global change in consciousness. And these are the catalysts that can do it. And people are discovering this now, or rediscovering. I mean, it was never really forgotten, but it's certainly becoming more widely known because of the internet, and also I just think many people share my feeling that our institutions are not responding. Our institutions are dysfunctional. Politics, religion, science to a certain degree are not bringing about the change in consciousness that needs to happen. So I'm encouraged by all this. So.
I like we all know the phrase, I guess, psychedelic renaissance at this point.
Yeah.
But because it's a renaissance, that means a rebirth. Something else came before. And I'm really interested to know what your thoughts are on how we can avoid the things that derailed the first, or the second, depending how people interpret it, but the last time psychedelics were trying to break into the mainstream of culture.
Yeah, I think a number of factors contribute to that. For one thing, we've had, since psychedelic research was more or less shut down around 1970, and it's taken a long time to force the door open again on research. And it's not only research. I mean, I think people should realize that there's more to this psychedelic renaissance than a resurgence in science. That's all good. That needs to happen. But we've also, when LSD came into our culture in the 60s, really, is when it got out there. We had no tools to deal with it. We had no tradition. LSD was alien to our culture, and the awareness of the fact that these medicines had been used for thousands of years, and indigenous people and so on, that was not widespread at that time, that understanding. So our cultures in general, I think, are, they're resistant to change. Something with the power of LSD to change consciousness is frightening to a lot of people because they don't really want that. They're very invested in the way things are. But we've now had 40 years, almost 50 years, really. I mean, 1967, the Summer of Love, that was 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So we've had that long to retool, essentially, our relationship to psychedelics, and we've learned a lot about how to use them in a positive way. And we've borrowed heavily from indigenous traditions, because where else are you going to, get this knowledge? But we're also developing our own paradigms. I don't think we can all become, indigenous shamans living in the jungle. That's not going to work. What we've got to learn what we can from them, use our own consciousness to develop a psychedelic culture that works for 2017 or the 21st century and beyond, So, and I think one big difference there is that as we have rediscovered psychedelics, there's more emphasis on the plants and the mushrooms, the natural sources. LSD is very much in the mix, but it's no longer just about LSD. And
right, yeah.
Look at the way that ayahuasca, for example, has really, permeated global consciousness. I mean, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, who had ever heard of ayahuasca? Only a few ethnobotanists. And,
You, for example.
well, I had heard of it. Other people had heard of it, but a small number of people, and even then, I never imagined that ayahuasca would kind of, sort of take over in the way that it's have, or just get onto the global stage. And now many more people know about it. And I have my feeling about why that's happening is it's not about us, it's about the plant teachers themselves. I think ayahuasca and these other medicines, but in this particular historical juncture, probably mainly ayahuasca, is waking up a lot of people. People are looking for something spiritually meaningful in their lives. They don't feel like our institutions are not supplying that. And I think people long for meaningful, fulfilling experiences, and they're looking outside our culture because they're not finding it. Our culture's wounded in a lot of ways, and I think this, as a result, we are all wounded in a lot of ways, and so we're looking as a species for healing, for answers, and then individual people are looking for healing. They aren't really separable. There would be far, fewer wounded people if our culture was nurturing and supported life and supported consciousness and all that. It doesn't. It works against that. There's the powers that be, or the people that think they're running things, let's say, that delude themselves that they're running things, have an agenda, and it's not a pretty one. I mean, as far as, obviously, I'm from the States and I see what's going on there, and I'm just appalled in some ways, that complete lack of the qualities that these people profess to support. They all wrap themselves, or not all, but most of them wrap themselves in some kind of cloak of Christian righteousness, to justify what they're doing. But I don't see a shred of mercy or compassion or all the values that Christianity is supposed to foster. And so clearly religious institutions have become essentially a bludgeon to keep people in line, to keep people from asking questions and really thinking. I mean, the last thing that religions want people to have is meaningful, personal, spiritual experiences.
That's dangerous.
They're threatening. They're dangerous, yeah. And as my brother said, and I've often said, psychedelics make you have funny ideas. And funny ideas are inherently dangerous, because they can destabilize the accepted order, and it needs to be destabilized. And we're in a process of metamorphosis. We're learning how to be better people, be better as a species, and we're trying to heal, to find a way to heal or bridge the separation that our culture has developed over the last 2,000 years or so from nature, our perceptions of nature. Because Christianity and other religions tell us that nature exists to serve us. We're, the point, we can dominate it, we can exploit it, we can rape it, we can do all the things that we're doing to it, because we're expected to, we're expected to devalue nature in a certain way, because our reward is in heaven, right? And so we should not value this world. And I think that's a really I think that's a con game, actually, because there's no evidence that there's an afterlife. Maybe there is, and maybe there isn't. If there is, it's certainly not the purview of any one religion. And So, we have to re-educate ourselves about our place in nature. And our place in nature should be symbiosis. Symbiosis is the key concept. We should learn to love nature and not necessarily control. I mean, it's not our place to control it. That's the wrong perception. But we,
How do
simply put, we have to listen to ourselves and to these medicines because they have an important message for us.
how do you talked about the Renaissance and about an awakening, and about symbiosis right now. How do you see that awakening? Like seeing that nature is like an independent source of a vector in evolution of intelligence that we need to talk to or be inspired by, or what does it mean for us as a culture, or as me as an individual, to awaken or to enter this communion with this other intelligence?
I think as a species we have to realize that we're not in control, that we're part of nature, and we our relationship to nature should be one of a mutual symbiosis is a partnership between different species for mutual benefit usually, and this is what ayahuasca and these other things are trying to get us to do, and to just wake up to that reality. And a number of things have to happen. For one thing, we have to acknowledge how little we really know about anything, and we have to acknowledge that we monkeys are not running the show, as I say very often, and that's quite true. So we also have to get humble. We have to admit that we're just a part of nature, and maybe a very small part in a certain way, and we have to admit that we have made grievous errors in a certain way, that this process has led now to this historical crisis, and not just in the 20th century, but over a long period, this situation has arisen, and now we're at some point where it seems to be coming to a head, where the decisions that we make as a species in the next 50 years will determine if life is going to persist on Earth or not. I mean, not life so much. I think life will persist in some form, but whether we will persist is really the question. And not only will we persist, but will we evolve to become something better? A wiser, more merciful, more compassionate species. We have to learn how to treat nature with respect and love. We have to learn how to treat each other with respect and love. Those are not separate things. And I think that I'm a believer in the Gaian idea. And I think these plants are essentially ambassadors from Gaia in a certain way. And this isn't just a New Age kind of quasi-mystical perspective. I think it's a very scientific perspective, because plants communicate with their environment through their chemistry. That's what they're very good at. And certain parts of the chemistry are neurotransmitters, and they happen to fit into the receptors in our brains, and this is a reflection of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years of coevolution. They happen to hit just those parts of their brains that activate these kinds of sensibilities, the mystical experience. You can put quotes around the mystical experience. What is the mystical experience? Well, there are certain aspects of it, the idea that we are all one. There is no separation, really. The idea that, we have an inherent, almost genetically programmed love for life. You can call it biophilia, maybe. And some of the perceptions of indigenous cultures, like animism, the idea that everything is alive, even the electron has a certain element of consciousness to it. So I think that's a shift. And that's not compatible with Western religion. The only thing that can be conscious or have a soul are human beings. I completely disagree. Everything has a soul. Everything has a degree of consciousness. So that's called animism. And then, if you want to use labels, pantheism is the other part. Pantheism is the idea that nature is divine. There is no divinity outside of nature. It is nature that's divine. So if you say, do I believe in God? I believe in God in that respect. I don't think there's anybody outside of it, some bearded man in a control room that's handling everything. It's not like that. So we're involved in this symbiotic partnership with nature, and the plant medicines are coming to us as ambassadors and talking to those that will listen, and that happens to be the people that see the value of these medicines. And the power of that is that people listen, and then they tell other people, and it's a catalytic process that can evolve very rapidly once it gets going. It's an exponential expansion, and these are the tools to do that. And then just with the internet, we can spread the information so quickly. And it's a good thing too, because there's not a lot of time left. We've got to get wise. We have to get wise, and we have to get wise fast. And so these plant medicines are catalysts for that. And conferences like this, and just educating everyone who will listen, stand with a megaphone on the steps of the station and say, plant medicines. Well, what does that mean? But unlike LSD, which, it has great power and all that, but it's still an invention in a way, and it's, and so when it came into the 60s, it was seen as, very threatening, and all the attention was on that. Now that's sort of spread to an interest in rediscovering some of these indigenous medicines. And in a way, it's much more subversive because it's, the way you spread it is spread information, spread the plants, do what plant people have always done. Like share your plants across the back fence. Get your neighbors to grow them, teach them how to use them, encourage them to tell their neighbors about it. So it's a very organic kind of co-evolutionary process, and that's why it's unstoppable. You cannot criminalize all of nature.
Though they're attempting to criminalize some of it.
There are attempts, but they're doomed. It's totally it can't happen because you just can't do it. And so this is going to work. It's too powerful. It's too subversive, and it just happens really quite quietly. And that's how ayahuasca's gotten so far as it has in the last 25 years. It happened because nobody was paying attention, and before that it kind of happened with the mushrooms, and now they're quite accessible. I really do think, without taking credit, I think that putting into the hands of millions of people the ability to grow mushrooms open up these realms of experience, has had an impact on society in a very positive way. If no more than making people aware that we do understand a very small part of nature, and there are realms of experience, realms of understanding that we never suspected. And so
there's a sort of sense of, I hear people talk of a generational shift that has to happen before big changes can come into effect, and yet I'm talking to you, and this isn't a generational shift. You've been consistent throughout this process.
Right.
Do you think one of the hardest parts of, I think, a psychedelic experience is the integration? And I
Yes.
wonder if what's been happening at a societal level is happening now, is attempting to integrate what's been learnt without simply overthrowing everything that was.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we're learning how to use these things, and the role of people like me. I guess I'm an elder, a sobering
words.
thought. But there it is, and we need elders, and elders in indigenous societies are valued for what they know and respected. Not so much in our society. Our society, by the way it treats older people, is kind of a statement that they're no longer valued. They're just marginalized, and but that's not the way to do it. I mean, the elders, and there are plenty of, there are plenty of old people who, never got the message or got it and forgot it or whatever, but some of us didn't. And, I'm as passionate about psychedelics now as I was 50 years ago. I still think they're really the best hope that we have to get conscious, and we have to do this. We have to get more conscious about getting conscious. It has to become our mission, because if you look at how quickly we're destabilizing all the feedback loops and feedback mechanisms that keep life on Earth stable, we're busy disabling those things. Once disabled, it's very hard to recover them. It's hard to just recover this equilibrium. Or what happens is you achieve another equilibrium, but it may not be the one that we want. It may not be an equilibrium, for example, that can tolerate, a crazy monkey like us, and we're completely out of control. Well, the Earth has a way of shrugging off these troublesome species, like a dog can shake off fleas. Do we really want that? If we would just get smarter, we should become our hope, our mission should be to be a partner in making sure that nature remains healthy, the planet remains healthy. And on the political level, all I see is pretty much idiocy and denial, and that's dismaying. I mean, it seems pretty obvious that that we're in a state of environmental collapse, and yet very little political will, at least globally, maybe more. I don't know where it's going to go. I'm hopeful that it's not too late. I don't send a message of despair, because for one thing, but the temptation to give in to despair is great. But despair is just paralyzes us. Just fear paralyzes us. We have to lose the fear. We have to realize that we can still make a difference. And I think we also have to get a more realistic and more big picture perspective on what is going on. We've only had these medicines in our culture, really. Indigenous cultures have had it for a long time, but in our culture, only in the last, really since the start of the 60s or whatever. So that's a very small slice of time when you're talking about a co-evolutionary process, and that's what we're talking about here. The Earth and biology operates on much longer timescales, and that gives me hope that, this is a glitch, this is a rough time. We can get past it, and I mean, it may be that our destiny is to leave the planet, eventually to leave the planet, or for big parts of our genome to move out, because this is what life does. It spreads, it wants to spread. It wants to fill new niches, and whether that's on Earth or throughout the galaxy is just a matter of scale. So life likes to spread. And if our species moves outside of the Earth and eventually outside the solar system, that probably is our destiny. But we also have to make sure that, what we leave behind is, a healthy ecosystem, something, a thriving nature, rather than, we poisoned our mother and now we have to leave, fast. Why shouldn't the Earth be a wonderful place for life to be for the next billion years? There's no reason why not.
Scale is a really challenging aspect here, because I think it's really important what you're emphasizing, to look at the big picture and understand this is a global environmental situation that we need to become conscious of. But then we have to be conscious in our daily lives and make those changes. And I wonder, for people who are working in office jobs, sort of your kind of the picture of working daily in the cubicle 9 to 5, what do you think the changes can be that they can put into effect? Because, as you said, not everyone can just go to the jungle and become a shaman.
Right.
What does it look like in daily life, do you think?
Well, I think in some ways we have to have the big picture in mind, but in some ways we have to refocus our efforts also on the local level, right? And the way civilization works now, it's all like global agriculture based on petroleum and a monoculture and all this. I think there needs to be a refocus on our local communities, our local institutions, and I guess there's a cliche, think globally, act locally. Mm-hmm. But there's truth to that. We have to create these nexuses, which is what we see happening here, for change, nodes, if you will, that will then spread out through the global culture like mycelia and join together eventually. But that's where it starts, and for people in a stuck in 9 to 5 jobs and, who isn't to a certain degree. But this is a reflection of the corporatization of humanity and nature and all that. We have to evolve better ways to operate. We have to get away from capitalism in a certain way. I think the notion of capitalism is dangerous. The idea that you have to have constant growth. Why? What does that serve? Just economic activity for economic activity's sake? What we want is not growth. We want equilibrium in a certain way. And people, I guess, have to make decisions about where they want to fit into this. And even if you have to work in a corporate environment, that doesn't prevent you as an individual from becoming conscious. And I think a lot of things are emerging that are going to change economic paradigms in a certain way. For example, I've been getting an education in the emergence of some of these cryptocurrencies. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very encouraging. That's a new economic model, and that will, if it lives up to its promise, that's going to change the nature of financial institutions, how you get revenues, how you use capital. It's because up to now, capital has been controlled by a very small group of people, and because they control the capital is what gets things done. This is the opposite of that. This is a way to put capital in everybody's hands, or not capital as such, but financial independence and that sort of thing. So I think it's a combination of all of these things, rethinking our financial institutions, rethinking our means of production, and and the way that we use our technology. And I don't have the whole answers, but I would like to see more of that and less of the globally oriented financial systems and means of production and all that, which in the end is reflects. I mean, it ends up that eventually those levers of power are put in the hands of a very small number of people.
Yeah.
And then they become the ones that think they control things until they don't anymore. But delusion is a powerful influence, and I think also part of the power of these things. These are also people. So the people who are in positions of influence and power on the global level, get them to eat plant medicines or drink plant medicines and wake up, and that's also happening. And in part, I just think, I think that, as in almost every generation, our real hope lies with the young, and dinosaurs will resist dying out, but they inevitably have to die out. That's what dinosaurs do, right? That's what they're famous for, is dying. The sooner the better. So that a new generation of people who live their lives with more clarity can take over. So in that sense, I'm really encouraged by the in young people, in millennials. I know there's many kinds, but this goes back to being in the bubble. But the millennials I run into seem as a generation much more conscious and compassionate and thoughtful than I ever was when I was their age. So that's really encouraging. And it's much more, we're much more open to sharing. I think that's good. That's partly also an effect of the internet. People are social media, social networks are bringing people together. You can bring communities of interest together, and you can develop essentially game-changing technologies and means of social organization, and spiritual institutions, approaches to medicine. All of these things need to become more life compatible and support life rather than despoil it. And again, I think the main influence here is just a consciousness, just waking up, and that's what the plant medicines are tools for doing.
I've been reading your memoir of the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, which I'm enjoying a lot, and I was reflecting on in the early parts where you talk a lot about your parents and your father in particular, and I think, other than just saying all the dinosaurs need to die out and things change, I wonder how we can attempt to help our parents if we are opening our minds, if we're trying to be more conscious, and through plant medicines or other modalities, meditation. Do you think that's how would you envisage that happening? Could you see that if you could have brought plant medicines into the relationship with your parents, it would have been it would have been a positive thing, or do you think it's a case of a generational divide that sometimes can't be bridged?
Well, I think sometimes there are, generational gaps that can't be bridged, but that's no reason not to try, because, I mean, you're how old?
31.
31.
Mm-hmm.
You're how old?
28.
28. How old are
who
your
looks
parents?
better? My parents are in their late 60s.
Late 60s. Well, so they're contemporaries of me. Maybe they're too old to change. I don't know. But I am not too old to change, so there's hope for them. I think we have to have these intergenerational dialogues. And that's another problem with the 60s. It was like a wholesale rejection of the older generation. And it needed to be rejected. I mean, they were quite deluded in many ways. But now, essentially, I think it's a matter of trying to foster dialogue and bring them around. Older, some will not. Some will, they're not open to it. But to the degree that you can engage the older generation and say, by both, argument and also by example, that it's working, it's not so bad. Your ideas are good.
I would love to.
A disadvantage, I mean, something that just unfortunately happens as you get older is you get more set in your ways and less receptive to these kinds of discussions.
I would love to take MDMA or plant medicine with my parents. I think that would.
Me too.
Would be.
I think this could be
challenging, but also very healing.
I totally agree. I think that's one way to do it, but they have to be open-minded enough,
absolutely,
and trusting in you enough to say, well, maybe there is value here, and if they're thoughtful people, then they can come to it. If they're totally brainwashed by mass media and Fox News and all that stuff, they may not want to. They may not be open to it, and then I don't know what you do. You just keep trying. I host ayahuasca retreats in the Sacred Valley on a pretty regular basis, and I've had families come down, and it's amazing to see what happens, just to have them share that experience.
What happens?
Well, they come, and they come with all the baggage that families have over time. They share this experience, and they go back with a lot more trust, a lot more appreciation for each other, their uniqueness and their differences, and basically just a lot more love, And I don't know that it always lasts, but they're meaningful experiences for them. And
isn't the research in this weekend is kind of indicating that these changes do last? They do cure things that haven't been cured before.
Yeah.
And they do deal with the mental, psychological, spiritual challenges almost everybody I know
has, right.
And
yeah, and so if you can persuade them, then it's remarkable what could happen on one of these retreats. If you can't go to a retreat, I mean, ideally, as psychedelics get integrated into society, if they do get approved for use in therapy or whatever, and here's the challenge, because the people that are ultimately hold the power to approve or disapprove these medicines are the ones you most need to convince, and the ones most whose minds are probably the most closed. So it's a tough challenge, but it is happening. We can now.
But aren't those the exact people that probably need the healing the most?
Yeah, if you go through those channels, then if you work within a framework of government approval for the use of these things and so on, then it is a challenge, because a lot of the people that created these laws, they have to be convinced. But it is happening. I mean, there's more research than ever. That's a very encouraging thing. When the government starts supporting that research, that will be an encouraging sign, because all the research is really kind of outside that framework. And that whole framework, maybe that needs to be brought down or certainly changed. I think one of the ways that is promising in medicine that addresses some of this is psilocybin, for example, can be used in hospice situations, help people with anxiety about their terminal state. And, we're all in a terminal state in some sense. But if they can be used to help people come to terms with the idea of death, that would be an improvement in medicine, because we don't do death very well. And yet eventually everyone reaches a point where any medical procedure is going to fail. And so I hope that psilocybin can be integrated into hospice situations, hospice use for terminal people. But then why not take it to the next step, where the dying person and their family can all share that experience? So, and I think that would be tremendously healing for families if there were a place where it's not everyone gathered around the hospital bed of the dying person and taking psilocybin. That probably is not a good model, but have places you could go that are not like hospitals, and, or where people could share these experiences in a good environment, see what comes out of that.
Do you think that these are the sorts of connections and relationships we might be able to have naturally between each other, and that the plants are helping us to get back to, that we've sort of either unlearned, or that the models we've created for ourselves, our culture, as a series of barriers to things that when people do experience them with psychedelics, they go, oh, wow, I remember this.
Yeah, I do. I think there's a lot of fear about it, and people have been brainwashed by all sorts of cultural forces, and brainwashed into fear and fear to ask questions, fear to share honestly our views and all that. And these things can be catalysts for overcoming these barriers. I don't think it's going to be a long process. It's going to take a while. It's not like suddenly you have these things and everything changes. It's a process that takes place over years, but it is happening, and it will happen, and it has to happen. I hope that it can continue. And there's a lot of forces arrayed against it, but ultimately I think it will overcome, because we have to find our way to these viable solutions.
What are the main trends in psychedelic research that you're most excited about at the moment? Because I know that there's a lot of new doors that are opening. It's not just re-establishing with science what a lot of people had found out experientially.
Right. Well, with respect to to the medical uses, then I think something like MDMA, we have a tool there that can help treat trauma, and PTSD or post-traumatic stress syndrome, or whatever you want to call it. And who is not traumatized? Almost everybody has been traumatized. Our culture is traumatizing and is traumatized itself. So there's a possible solution. And as more and more people get these treatments and it's shown that they really work, then they'll get a reception. And the same with the use of psychedelics in terminal situations. That's another doorway in. If you can prove that psychedelics are useful for the dying, then the next step is to show that they're useful for the living. I think that in psychedelic research, we tend to emphasize that, well, these are medicines, therefore you have to have something wrong with you to benefit from the medicine. And so we need to change perspective that way too. You don't have to have anything wrong with you. We all can become better people, right? That's not that you're flawed or sick or anything, but we all recognize that we can become more evolved. And I think so. Once that's recognized, and that's a tough one in our culture, because we medicines are things you give to sick people to help them get better, but we have to recognize, we have to expand that concept to realize medicines are things that you give to well people so that they can become better too. I mean, it's not, sickness is not a prerequisite for taking these medicines. What I think, because they're learning tools, right? And what they teach you about is consciousness. So that's something, we've never had a drug like that before, where you can use them as a probe to understand consciousness. The results of and that's important, because we have to understand consciousness. We have to, in order to become conscious. And some of the results of the hospice end of life anxiety at the end of life studies with psilocybin, have been quite remarkable in that, and afterwards people get to rate the meaningfulness of their experience. So some significant number, like in the Johns Hopkins spirituality study, something like 40% said it was the most meaningful experience of their entire lives. Well, what our culture has a deficit in is meaningful experiences. So if you've got a medicine that can reliably do this, I don't know why we all wouldn't want to have access to that. Because meaning is what is lacking in our lives.
Well, what's the best way to go about that, to become more conscious, and what way to use psychedelics? And do you think that this trend can become a part of capitalism? You said there's a deficit, so you use an economic term to describe an experience. So can it become like a commodity? Maybe that's some people's view on the ayahuasca culture right now as well, that becomes a commodity, and these indigenous cultures, they are exploited in some way, some economic way. What's your view on that?
Well, yeah, I think it's kind of tricky. I think that it will have to become a commodity in some way. I don't think the revenue model is to, just produce these substances and sell them. They require a context. They require a therapeutic context. The revenue model is not in the substance. The revenue model is in creating these institutions where people can go and have these experiences, and there are qualified people there who know how to look after them. I think there would be a great, and the only way this is happening right now in the States and maybe other places is through the religious model. I mean, if you want to take ayahuasca in the States, you can join the Santo Daime, you can join the UDV and take ayahuasca legally. But if you happen not to be a joiner, or you don't like the religious context, then you're just out of luck till something changes. So I think, in some ways, I think the religious use of these things is a good thing, because it's moving it forward. But I wouldn't want to see it in an age where if you wanted to take psychedelics, you had to be members of this or that church, because they also are their power structures. I mean, just like any other power structure, they may be fairly benign, but they're power structures. And you never know how power structures can, go off track. I mean, that's where we need certain wisdom to not let that happen. I mean, if you look at spiritual traditions through the ages, it's very often, it may start out with good intentions, but it ends up being the sort of co-opted by those whose agenda may not be so planet-wide, may be motivated by greed and so on.
Then what's the difference between one hand nature and the other hand like a power structure? Is there a difference between it?
A difference between nature
and a power structure? So
well, the power structures that we have defined in our culture are, and this is changing, but are all about owning nature. I mean, they don't operate as part of nature, even though they really are. But those that control them are not thinking that they're advancing all life on Earth or advancing the cause of consciousness, in the cosmos or whatever. I think they're thinking about profits for their shareholders for the next quarter. And that is a problem. That's a problem, but it can be changed. And, that's a way to get beyond it.
I think a lot of our audience and listeners are feeling that sense of a lack of meaning that you described. And when we work with the plant medicines, we use these psychedelic experiences, it sounds as though that from your perspective, something is coming, some intelligence is coming over from the plants as well. Do you think that that in itself is this act of symbiosis, of you bring parts of yourself to the table, but also something comes from the other side? And yet we also talk about MDMA being such an effective medicine to use, but that's not a natural substance. No. Is there a division there that you feel or think is important to understand?
Well, somewhat, but I don't reject synthetics. Just in the first place, they are natural because they're made by natural organic chemists, right? And that's part of the perception. We have to realize whatever we create, even the destructive things, are part of nature, because we're not separate from nature. And I think that's a problem too. I think that we have to recognize that moral dimensions of human actions, human behavior, comes from us. We're the monkeys. We're the ones that operate out with this moral compass, or not. Things do not have moral qualities, but there are lots of ways to misuse things and use them in ways that are evil. But that's coming from us, is how we choose to use them. And there's a big disjunct, and has been really for a long time, maybe since the Industrial Revolution. There's a big disjunct between our essentially between wisdom and cleverness. We've gotten very, very clever at doing all sorts of remarkable and beneficial things to the environment, but at the same time we have the potential to do a lot of harmful things. So we have to be cognizant of our power, and we have to learn how to use those things with clarity, so that we're, we have to bring our cleverness and our inventiveness together with our wisdom, with our ability to reject these things, even though we can do them. But if it doesn't seem like the right thing, then maybe rethink it, or not do it. So I think psychedelics are learning tools in that respect. They can help us get that kind of clarity. And to that extent, I think they're powerful learning tools.
Or even tools how to learn as well. It seems you're describing the ability to use discernment as opposed to simply having a download of sudden truth into you. You're also learning how to analyze a situation in your relationships in a way that isn't just straight through the ego. Learning how to learn, I guess. Yeah. As I guess a couple of questions to bring things to a close. One that it always sounds a little hokey and yet I think always produces interesting answers. If you could go and give your 25-year-old self some advice or pat him on the shoulder and whisper some words in his ear, what do you think you would say?
I could give my 25-year-old self some advice. Well, I don't know. Get a real job.
That sounds cruel.
No, I think I would tell him trust in yourself. Don't accept don't take things on faith. Don't let people tell you what to think. Figure out what to think. In that sense, trust yourself. Don't get sucked into cults or dogmas or doctrines, or don't let yourself be brainwashed, because the culture likes to do that. So learn to think with clarity and trust yourself, and use that ability to think, to evaluate every situation you come to and make of it what you will. That doesn't mean you can't listen to elders or learn from all sorts of sources, but ultimately it comes down to you. So practice mindfulness, clarity of thinking, and that would be my advice.
That's good. That's good advice, and maybe it partly answers the question that we like to ask on the High Existence podcast: that what would leading a high existence mean to you? What does that conjure up for you?
What would leading a high existence?
High existence.
Well, I think that I think in part it would involve obviously the use of these medicines and having the courage to step out of your reference frame every once in a while, give yourself a reality check in a certain way, and try to think with clarity, try to integrate what you learn in a way that benefits you and everyone you encounter. Treat people with respect and compassion. And love even, and part of that is to, well, after having made all these judgmental statements, but part of it, is to not be too quick to judge people, not be too quick to judge people, but not be too quick to accept a set of beliefs or doctrines or dogmas, or it's kind of like if somebody tells you that they have it all figured out, they don't have it figured out. That's a sure sign that they don't have it figured out. So you meet, and there are plenty of people willing to say, come follow me, this cult, this religion, this cultural or spiritual leader. I mean, as a species, we like to follow, and I guess a certain amount of that is okay, but better not to. Better just to keep your, follow yourself, have faith in yourself, and don't let anyone tell you what to think. Don't mindlessly accept any premises about what you should think. This is my main problem with religion, because basically that's exactly what they want you to do. They want you to accept a certain set of precepts or beliefs or so on, often which have no evidence or very little evidence, and they want you to, just accept that on faith. So faith, in my view, is an invitation to stop thinking.
Yeah, it's outsourcing your critical judgment. Outsourcing your critical judgment to others.
Your critical judgment, exactly.
But you do have faith in nature, right? Is that like the Gaian perspective you mentioned earlier? Is that your
Well,
religion?
I don't really have to have faith in nature. I make a distinction between faith and belief. You can believe things, and if there's evidence for it, then that's all to the good, because that's not blind faith. That's, you can believe things because that's how knowledge accumulates, and you do build up, a set of beliefs that seem pretty solid. So it's okay to believe. I believe in nature. I'm not sure nature demands that I have faith. Doesn't really do that. And the same is true of psychedelics. I mean, very good example. You don't have to have faith to take psychedelics. That's an impediment. That's actually get rid of the faith. What you have to have is courage. And then if you apply that to the psychedelic, find out for yourself, what is the plant messenger's message, to you. And that takes courage. Faith just gets in the way of it. If by faith you mean acceptance of a set of beliefs or premises or so on, for which there's no evidence, and just because somebody says you should do it, if you want to be part of this religion or this cult or this party or this, so in that sense, I think that, that's the main thing that we have is, we don't need faith. What we need is courage, and, the place to have faith is to have faith in ourselves, and just our ability to think.
And more research, maybe.
And what?
More research.
Yeah. More research, all of that. But people are pushed and pulled in so many different directions by everything and everyone they come in contact with, and everything. If you just look at our culture, it's, buy this, do that. You won't be a fulfilled person until you own a Mercedes, or, you take this vacation or whatever it is. All of these things are messages, in some ways, to people that they don't have any value until they own something or do something. You want to be with the cool people. You want to be at the height of fashion or whatever. None of this stuff really matters. You can participate in it as long as you keep perspective, as long as you realize that this is not really what matters. Our culture is very good at producing distractions, and even more so. I think that's a real hazard in this culture. So much information, so many pretty things, so many fascinating things. You can't do it all. So you have to focus on what's important for yourself, what's really meaningful, right? Like, I guess that's it. don't let anyone tell you what is meaningful. Find what is meaningful for yourself. And then just go for it. Balls to the walls.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the takeaway message.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, for sitting down with us here, because I know it's a very busy schedule at the conference for you. I know our listeners are going to love hearing what you've had to say. And remember, people, balls to the wall when you find what that meaning is.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Dennis. I really
Thanks
appreciate
for
your time.
asking me.
Thank you, Dennis.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you appreciate the High Existence podcast, there are a few ways you can support it. You can go to highexistence.com/donate to become a supporter of our efforts, or you can invest in yourself by buying one or more of our self-development tools at store.highexistence.com. You can also leave reviews on iTunes or share it with your friends on social media. Thank you so much for tuning in, and cheers to a high existence.